Hello and welcome to On Point. I am Lupita Baltazar. Most people hope that everyone who needs help living with a disability would be treated equitably. Unfortunately, people from different racial backgrounds aren't always treated the same. In California, the organizations required by law to provide services for people with disabilities are called regional centers. The regional centers diagnose disabilities and then connect people to counseling, therapy, education, as well as help with housing, employment, learning to live independently, and even buying equipment like wheelchairs. But according to the report by the legal advocacy group Public Counsel, most of the California regional centers spend less on services for Latino clients than for white clients. People living in different regions also get different levels of service. For example, the regional center serving Central LA County spend more than $8,500 less on the average Latino client. That's the biggest gap in the state. Another report found Asian or Latino adults are more likely to receive no services at 15 out of 19 regional centers. These disparities have worsened since 2016, according to the group Disability Voices United. The organization says regional centers must be held accountable for these gaps.
I can tell you that a number of years ago, there was a regional center that families were coming to us, particularly from the Latino community, saying that they're not getting services. And so our organization started showing up with them to support them at board of directors meetings to complain about the fact that the regional center wasn't providing services. And the boards of directors just sat there, listened, ignored them, and then moved on. So instead of not coming back, we came back with twice as many people. And I went up to the chair of the board after one meeting and I said, you know, it is your job to hold the executive director accountable for the fact that there are such significant racial disparities in your regional center. And she said, well, we can't really hold our executive director accountable.
The state's Department of Developmental Services says it has made addressing these disparities a priority. Today on Point, we ask why do regional centers spend less money on people of color with disabilities? And why do white people receive more services as measured by dollars spent? On Point's Sade Pullen has more.
Thank you, Lupita, for that intro. Today we have our guest, Brian Capra from the law firm of Public Counsel, and Nina Spiegelman, Director of Policy at Disability Voices United. All right, guys, how are you guys doing today?
Very good, thanks.
Great. So firstly, I wanted to ask, could you guys describe for our audience what a regional center is for disability?
Sure, I can give an answer, and perhaps Nina can supplement. But regional centers are nonprofit, private organizations that contract with the state to coordinate and provide services to persons who are developmentally disabled or for very young children who have developmental delays in our state.
If I could just add to that, I mean, that's exactly right. But they are a very odd creature. They are provided for. Their creation is in the statute and inside the Lanterman Act. But it provides for 21 regional centers throughout the state that are, as Brian said, private, nonprofit organizations. But they receive via, statute and via a contract with the State Department of Developmental Services, all the federal funding and state funding to disperse to people with developmental disabilities who are deemed to be eligible for their services.
And what kind of services exactly do they provide for the disabilities?
That's going to vary by age. There are two main programs that the regional centers provide, and one is called Early Start, sometimes known as Early Intervention, and then the other one is the services under the Lanterman Act, which is the statute that Nina just mentioned. So if you're talking kids under 3 years old, they're getting intensive therapies such as speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, infant stimulation programs. When you get into school-age children, they turn 3, they stay on with the regional center, they qualify that Nina has mentioned. You're really focusing on family supports, and respite is a big one. Behavioral intervention treatment programs, social skill programs, daycare programs and things of that nature. Lastly, I would say for the adult population, really you're looking at independent living skill programs, day programs, work habilitation programs, and things of that nature.
Age does really matter in terms of sort of, your interaction and what kinds of services you're getting directly from regional center support. So there's that early intervention that Brian was talking about. Then there's a big period of time from school age. So it's basically 3 to age 22, where the focus, the sort of service of first instance is really from school districts. Under the law, the regional centers, they're considered, and you'll hear this a lot, the payer of last resort. So if there is a generic service out there that has a statutory responsibility to provide a service, you have to go there first. And so from ages 3 to 22, that is the first instance, the purview of the school districts. That doesn't mean regional centers out of the picture, because you can, if the road to getting the coverage needed for kids of young adult and younger kids, often there's more than just a school district can provide. And then the regional center, theoretically, you can make an argument, we still need more. We still need respite services, for instance, is a very common service, to give the parents some break, because they are 24/7, having a lot of care that often has to have a therapeutic quality with their loved ones. After 22, the big areas of focus, in addition, as Brian said, independent living skills, but the big issue for the world, and it's not just in the world of developmental disabilities, is where do people live, is housing. And so the services there range from the most sort of, modern, giving you the most choice and control, something called supported living. So you have support to live independently, with support in a place that you can, you either own or have the lease for. And they range all the way to still there's group homes and more congregate settings of living. And so, and that, that's a big bulk of expenditures at regional centers. There are also day programs. So this is at, 22 and beyond. And that those now, a lot of programs now have to meet federal requirements for being more integrated settings. And so there's a lot of flux in sort of the way those programs roll out, but those are the kinds of services that you can get. And there's definitely behavioral supports, there's equipment, it's a very broad range of supports and services.
All right, great. Thank you for that explanation. So recently, this past October, actually exactly October 27th, the Los Angeles Times released an article talking about racial disparities at regional centers. And I was wondering if you guys had any comment or read the article or were aware of any racial disparities at regional centers.
Perhaps Nina should take the lead on this, because the October 27th article was prompted by a wonderful report, but I'll let Nina elaborate further on that.
Nina?
I'm actually going to make Brian talk a lot more about it, because my organization, Disability Voices United, put out a report, but really following Brian's lead, who was focused on, had a very similar amazing study earlier on children served by regional centers. We followed on to that, inspired very much by him, and looked at, really try to do a deep dive into the regional centers and the state's own data on services, provided, and try to really go deep into regional centers and highlighted, where disparities, where disparities are the sharpest, and also found in, we were assuming, because it's no secret that there are racial and ethnic disparities at regional centers. That's an open, there's grant programs trying to address them. It's out there. But we did find, what we try to do is really try to go deep into the data, because until you go literally regional center by regional center, it's hard to get a sense of really what's going on. And But we also found there were significant geographic disparities. And so, this is a system with 21 different, organizations administering this massive multi-billion dollar amount of money. You're going to have a very varied, the picture is going to be complicated. And certainly when it comes to disparities, it is. But I'll turn it over to Brian.
I'll follow up on that. And it was a great name of the report, A Matter of Race and Place, which really just says what Nina says, that you're looking at significant differences among the different main ethnic populations served by the regional centers. And that's very troubling. And their report underscores that not only statewide in terms of the aggregate, but you could just pick one regional center and look at within the four walls of that regional center and see that among whites versus Latinos versus African Americans versus Asians versus people who are classified as this other ethnicity category, which is not an insignificant amount of people. Quite a few people are now being categorized as other, according to the state's demographics. But startling disparities just within one regional center among those five main ethnic groups. But then the report also looks at one regional center versus another regional center. And sometimes you might have distance being accounted for, rural areas versus urban areas. But then you see from Disability Voices United report, startling findings, in my opinion, of urban centers where, for instance, West Side Regional Center and its lowest funded population, Latinos, are still getting more services than Harbor Regional Center and its largest funded, its highest funded population, which is white within that regional center. And those are both urban areas, and they're coastal communities. And so that was very, very troubling and compelling, and really underscores the need for this type of work and this exposure. So that's A Matter of Race and Place. And I would just say my study came out in May, and again was focused on children 0 to 2 and children 3 up to 22 years old. And my focus there looked at really sort of a longitudinal study over the past 6 years to see if there had been improvement made among the 21 regional centers statewide for these age populations over time. And my findings concluded that very little, the needle has moved very, very little, notwithstanding quite a bit of investment that's been put into this. Nina mentioned this a bit earlier about the disparity reduction programs that have been in effect now since 2016. And the state has allocated $11 million per year. And at the time of my report in May, that was $66 million invested already. And this year, they've allocated $22 million. They've doubled that investment to somehow try to get over the hump. So we're going to be $88 million into this by the end of the next fiscal year, in next June. And very little to show for at least with, well, not only with the children, but also as Disability Voices United has exposed, very little improvement's been made within the adult population as well. So I think that kind of summarizes more or less what the LA Times and the Orange County Register and a number of other news outlets have recently reported out on.
Yes, and I liked how you guys both mentioned, the locations of these regional centers and how that really affects services. So my next question was, why are services based off of locations and where people are? Like, we were talking about the Latino community. Say a Latino community that location is obviously more Hispanic based and they get less funding, or if a white neighborhood has more white people, then they get more funding. Why is it based on location? Shouldn't it just be regional center by regional center? Why is it based on location? If you guys have any theories or any answers to that.
Well, the data that is available, unfortunately, doesn't get that discrete. As much as we would love to have that information, we'd love to have the funding amounts according to zip codes, for instance, so we can really go neighborhood by neighborhood to see who's getting what. Unfortunately, the way the data is reported, it just looks at, here's the population of this category that we served over the past year. And so that would include folks in all regions. I mean, I could pick Harbor Regional Center just as an example. And so you're looking at folks not only in Wilmington area by the docks, but you're also looking at Rancho Palos Verdes and all that. All that's going to get mixed in, and some of those other communities, Hermosa Beach and things of that nature. That and so the population, we know that a lot of the ethnicities are concentrated within certain zip codes, but that's not how it's being reported out. So we just have the regional center by regional center data to operate from. Now, having said that, though, there is still troubling disparities, what I like to call inter-regional center disparities, when you compare one regional center against another one. And some might say, well, rural communities, if you're looking at Central Valley versus, an urban center like in LA or in the Bay Area, there might be some argument that, the cost of living might be lower in those communities, but I know there's other challenges. I mean, transportation needs are greater in those areas because it's not so easy to get served or to be served. And so a lot of things go back and forth. Arguments could be made, in other words, on both cases as to why one regional center might be getting more, might be serving at a greater rate than others. But then you just kind of look at the urban areas themselves, and you wonder why, Golden Gate Regional Center in San Francisco is serving significantly more people than, at least for the children, than Regional Center of the East Bay across the Bay. And the findings from my report, again, another startling figure, is that 54% of African American children 3 to 22 got zero. The majority of that group didn't get served, and the minority were those who got at least $1 in services. So you compare that with some of the figures in Golden Gate, and you just don't see that significant rate of deprivation. And they're both urban centers. And what accounts for one being on one side of the bridge vis-a-vis the other regional center doesn't make sense.
Right. And I would just, I agree with everything that Brian just mentioned. It's all really important, really perplexing. But it's so interesting. I think it's a first step to really honing in on, wow, there's a lot to pick apart. And just like in the Bay Area, in LA, you do have these regional centers. They're called catchment areas. If you live in a certain, you live in an area, across the street from you may be the dividing line, sort of like where you are in a school district, and that's a different regional center. And is it, where, and that's why we are all recommending, I think, how important it is to study, like really look at root causes of some of these things and do a really thoughtful review. It's not a question, I think, of not realizing that this is a problem, but now that there's a little bit more of a detail focus, it's sort of like, what are the policies? What are the policy differences at these regional centers? What's the leadership difference? And what kind of systemic structural things can we recommend to lift us all up? So I just think, it is really great that the data is generated. And of course we want even more. So it's as Brian said, it would be so incredible to get that zip code kind of data, but we have catchment area data, and that's the best we can do, and work with that. I think this will help all the grad schools. There's so many grad school theses waiting to be written from this topic, but you know.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. And speaking with Brian, I know you work specifically with children and disabilities. So, Brian, your organization, the Legal Advocacy Group at Public Counsel, found racial disparities spending on children and teens. Could you expand more on these findings? I know you kind of touched on it a little bit more when you were speaking on the last question.
With the most recent findings, again, we have we're looking at the 5 main groups that I mentioned: white, Latino, Asian, African American, and other ethnicity. And the findings with respect to 3 to 22-year-old children is that, interestingly, African American children have made improvement, and are now receiving per capita expenditures at a higher rate than white children now. But there's a caveat and an asterisk to that I'd like to mention in a brief minute. But other than African American, the other 3 populations are languishing. They're really not improving. Marginally so with respect to Latino, and when you're looking at the Asian population, they're just sliding further down. The other ethnicity population that I mentioned, that's sort of like this catch-all or multicultural or declined estate, or regional center hasn't done the work to figure out who this child should be belong to. We do believe that some of these kids categorized as other ethnicities should really more accurately be classified as African American or Latino. We think that that is a problem. But having said that, the other ethnicity population is performing at the lowest. They're getting 68 cents on the dollar for every dollar spent on whites. And then with the 0 to 2 population, the younger ones, we don't see disparities as profound as we do with the 3 to 22-year-olds. But there, where I mentioned earlier, where African Americans are receiving more than whites for 3 to 22, that's not the case for kids 0 to 2. The little ones getting served, the infants and toddlers, African American children are getting less than whites. They're getting 89% of what whites get. And again, the other population is performing at the worst, and they're getting 80% of what white little ones are getting 0 to 2. So those are the big findings. There hasn't been improvement despite the $66 million invested in it. And the other thing I want to mention, and I alluded to it earlier, we have 3 regional centers in the past year, the most recent data. I mentioned Regional Center of the East Bay. There's 2 others, Central Valley Regional Center and San Diego Regional Center. They're African American populations. Over 50% are unserved. The majority are not being served with anything. They're getting 0. Either they didn't get anything authorized to them in the first place, or something was authorized and yet they weren't able to actually realize any funding from what was authorized. And both those issues need to be explored. And so with the case of African American children, those are 3 regional centers that are depriving children at a greater rate, over 50%. And when you do that, this is where mathematically it kind of gets complicated. You have the dollar amount, but if it's only going to a smaller group of kids, like in the case of the Regional Center of the East Bay, 46% of African American children got something, 54% got 0. So the dollar amount, the total dollar amount that we see these per capita expenditures, that only got divided by 46% of the population. That artificially inflates their per capita amounts. So it looks like they're doing better than they actually are. Yeah, they're equal to whites, but at what cost? For goodness sakes, 54% of the kids there didn't get anything. And that's where we see that mirage. So a lot of troubling issues here. And so I wouldn't be quick to pat myself on the back in terms of improvement between African Americans and white children over the past couple years.
Right. Thank you for that. And we have about 2 minutes left, so I want to ask Nina one question, possibly to wrap things up. Brian, you can, add in your 2 cents as well. For Disabilities United and for the Public Council, what do you guys think that you guys could do to lower these racial disparities?
Well, we had, a whole bunch, as we have in other reports, of recommendations about things that could be explored. And, certainly there may need to be some, legislative fixes to have greater oversight and accountability for the entire system. But, doing a deeper dive into what is, root causes, just there's been some work done on improving kind of a cultural humility or cultural sensitivity, but we think that it needs to go deeper into sort of a cultural humility, aspect, beyond just cultural sensitivity training. And, I think a look, certainly what would really help us all, I think improve it seems counterintuitive a little bit, but massively overhauling our data system so that we really know what's going on, and so that people have access to their the information on them. I think that's the beginning, so that we're not doing, it is so labor intensive to put these, you can see like the granularity of, Brian's report, but that was a 6-year study. That was a lot of work over time. And I think, I know, something big and systemic like a data overhaul would really be, so helpful. But I want to make sure Brian can chime in here.
Yeah, we have a few seconds left. So
I would just absolutely agree with everything that Nina said. And the last time this was looked at extensively was in 2013. There is a report online. It's a task force, equity and diversity task force report that was issued back in 2013. But that was 9 years ago, and so much has changed since then. And we really need to do another deep dive again by such a commission, and involve the community this time. Community-based participatory research, engage the actual people, and not just handpicked professionals to kind of dictate what they think to be the case. Get the community involved.
Thank you guys so much for joining our show. Thank you for watching On Point. We'll be right back.
There are almost 6 million military and veteran caregivers across the nation. One of the most important elements of caregiving is taking care of yourself.
Visit aarp.org/caregiving for a free military veterans guide to navigate your caregiving journey.
Thank you for watching On Point. You can follow us on social media at CSUN On Point. You can hear us on KCSN 88.5 FM on Sunday mornings at 5:30. You can watch us on LA 36 and Santa Clarita Valley Television. For all of us here at On Point, I am Lupita Baltazar.